Okay, so this is the lecture for chapter 23, which is nutrition. This lecture will actually be for Wednesday. It must be the 22nd. You looked at digestion yesterday, and so this is a takeoff and a play on nutrition and why we ingest food to break it down through that digestive system to be able to provide, number one, fuels, and number two, building block sources for our bodies and for the hypothalamus, the thyroid gland, to be able to run those daily metabolic processes that we talk about. Okay, so here are unit objectives. So we're just going to look at the classifications of nutrients. We'll talk about the food sources and the macromolecules associated with our food sources: carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. You'll need to know that for the exam, definitely. Basic utilizations of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. We'll talk about the storage areas, the deficiencies, as well as fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. We'll define what vitamins are in relationship to, or why they are different than minerals. And we'll also define the basic metabolic rate. Okay. Let's look at the basics of nutrition and metabolism. First of all, we have to define what nutrients are. Nutrients are those chemicals that are supplied by the environment that help us survive. Okay, it's food, man. So when we talk about nutrients, they are chemical components that are needed for the body to survive on a daily basis. They fall into two categories. The first one is called a macronutrient, which means we need a lot of them. We get a lot of them. They're easily and readily available. The macronutrients, 4 of them, and really in some other books, your book does not point this out, but in other books, they have 5. Okay, so we know the 3 basics ones. Number 1, carbohydrates. Number 2, proteins. And you could put a little arrow out there and put down amino acids, because amino acids are made from proteins. The third component, fats or lipids. And again, we know that all fats fall into one category in which they are hydrophilic. One more time. They are hydrophobic and they are scared of water. Therefore, that's the only defining characteristic feature of all of those fat-based products. Water. Well, wait a minute. Water doesn't really have any nutrient in it, does it? Go without water for 24 hours and see if it has nutrient benefit for you. Now, is there actually any nutrient benefit in it? Maybe not, especially distillated water. However, it doesn't mean that your body doesn't have to have it on a regular basis. Okay? Your body can only go about 24 hours without water before you start to see minimal effects of dehydration occurring. You can go up to 72 hours without food before the effects begin to take place. However, we know that the body can go much longer without food and water, but we're talking about without running into detrimental effects for not having those macronutrients. The micronutrients that you see right there, listed vitamins and minerals. Well, what's the difference? Aren't they all kind of the same? Nah. They have some similar pathways and they have some similar functions. However, they're made of very, very different based materials. These guys right here, the vitamins, are organically based nutrients that the body requires on a regular basis. So again, carbon and hydrogen plus generally one other element. So vitamins are organically based. They have a carbon structure ring as their base component. Minerals are those things that we find directly off the periodic table and generally kind of on the left side of the table because they have a lot of metallic properties to them. Calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium, all found in those metals on the left side of the chart. So this is the inorganic based material required for survival. So make sure you can tell me the difference between the two. The other component we need to talk about is called essential nutrients. Essential means that they have to be provided. Okay, so the essential nutrients cannot just be manufactured by our body. They must be collected out through nutritional sources. If we don't have them, we don't survive, right? Because they are nutrients that are needed for survival. Amino acids, fats, vitamins. Okay. Here are our classifications, and we just talked about them again. Carbohydrates are organic-based sugars and starches. Fuel sources to be burned. Most of these guys are catabolic in their nature. Catabolism, remember, our cat in the anatomy lab, we're going to break down so that we can look at all the parts and pieces. Catabolic-based materials, we're going to break down so that we can use them for fuel sources. Number 2 are called lipids. And again, the lipids are organically based fats and oils. Again, the only thing that they have in common is that they do not like water. I will return in 1 second. All right, I apologize. It was more like 30 seconds, but with all of the conversation, a lot of times I get a little bit dry, so you're going to hear me sucking down a little bit of water to keep going through this process. The third component is called proteins. And again, proteins are made of nothing more than amino acids linked together on top of each other. There's that component of water. We've already talked about it. And we talked about the vitamins and their organically based compounds versus the minerals, which are the inorganically based animals. Trace elements are a type of minerals. However, they're only needed in very, very small amounts. Okay, so we give them the designation of trace minerals as opposed to regular minerals. And we're just designating that we don't need nearly as much of them. So here we go with the carbohydrates. Here are sources generally from plant. There is a little bit of glycogen that's found in meat, but we're looking at starches and sugars generally. I don't care about the recommended daily allowances. However, excesses can lead to, number 1, obesity. Number 2, we talked about what dental caries are. They're cavities. Okay, so make sure that we're keeping check on the amount of carbohydrate going in. But believe it or not, and I know this sounds crazy, too much carbohydrate actually impedes the ability to absorb up a lot of the nutrients, because carbohydrates, highly processed levels of carbohydrates, can be very invasive to the villi, the intestinal villi that are there. And large amounts being dumped in at one time takes a big toll on the insulin levels that have to be manufactured by the pancreas. Okay, deficiencies can lead to what is called metabolic acidosis. When we get to chapter 25, I will explain exactly what metabolic acidosis is. If you do not have enough glucose rotating in the blood, it will cause significant issues with the body systems. Utilization of carbohydrates. Here we go, one more time. Oxidation, or what we call catabolic oxidation, or oxidative catabolism, is glucose in the presence of. So put glucose plus O2. Put a big arrow. Glucose in the presence of oxygen provides for us ATP plus CO2 plus H2O. And we're going to come back to that formula a number of times over the next couple of weeks. And it'll be very, very key in the explanation of this metabolic acidosis, or respiratory acidosis as well. Okay, so there is our storage format, stored in the liver, in the muscles. We've talked about this a number of times. There's the glycogen, the simple storage format delivered by the insulin to the liver or the skeletal muscle, converted back through glycogenolysis, lysis meaning the splitting of. So we're just going to split the glycogen. Glucagon will cause that process of glycogenolysis to take place. Okay, over a long period of time, if you are not burning out that glycogen as stored fuel sources, it will be converted to a fat, and it will be stored in the adipose tissue. This is what causes those adipose tissues to expand over time. Okay, again, here is the utilization of carbohydrates, and what we're looking for is this right here. Glucose in the presence of oxygen provides for us ATP plus CO2 plus H2O through the respiratory, but also through glycogenolysis and lipogenesis, and we'll talk about those here in just a few minutes. But what I really want to focus on is this right here. Glucose in the presence of oxygen, so as long as there's oxygen available, it will provide for us ATP plus CO2 plus H2O. Lipids. And again, the only defining factor that lipids have in common is that they don't like water. They're hydrophobic. Okay? Sources, there are your sources right there. And you have seen a big shift in the conversation towards a lot of the plant oils that are out there, especially coconut oil, because we have found that it is a great, great source of certain lengths of carbon chains that we don't get in other food sources. And we're also finding that coconut oil can actually help to reduce the levels of rotating cholesterol in our blood. Excesses. Now, there's a big debate going on about obesity and the increase in serum cholesterols because in a lot of cases we're finding out that lipids may not be the source. It may be the breakdown of the amino acid and too much amino acid being rotated through the system, as well as the amount of sugar that's in our system at any one time. Okay, so deficiencies can lead to weight loss, skin lesions, big hormonal imbalances. Why? Because remember, there's a whole segment of hormones that are made by what we call cholesterol. Well, what's cholesterol? Cholesterol is a type of lipid, and that cholesterol is creating what we call a steroid ring, okay? Utilization of lipids, it can be oxidized and used for energy. However, it does take a lot of energy to produce that oxidation and to get that reaction started. Therefore, the body will choose to use carbohydrates as this is a test question, I guarantee you. The body will choose to use carbohydrates as its first source of fuel. It loves glucose. The brain absolutely loves glucose because it doesn't take nearly as much energy to convert protein-based materials as it does lipid. Your body will always choose to use protein as its second source of fuel. So unless you're actually telling the body that you're using that protein as a building block material and you can't have it as a fuel source, it will choose to take your muscle next. That's why it is so unbelievably important to do some weight-bearing exercise when you're trying to go through a weight loss regimen. You have to trick the body into using the lipid because it knows it can't use the protein because you're using that during some kind of weight-bearing exercise. And even it can be a little bit of lifting that you are doing to encourage the muscles to keep the protein that's there, okay? There is the pathway for the utilization. Now, I don't expect that you know this pathway. However, there are a couple of things I want to look at, okay? When we look at fat and foods that have fat in them, they will go through, this is important, this will be an exam. They go through a process called hydrolysis. Again, hydro means water, lysis means the breaking apart. So the breaking apart by the infusion of water. And what we find is it gets broken down into fatty acids. And when we try and use them as a fuel source, there is a big byproduct called ketone bodies. This also occurs in the protein pathway. Ketone bodies and ketones are a functional group that if left to build up in the body system can be very, very damaging to the kidney. We will talk about it when we get to chapter 25 and we talk about the acid-base balance and we talk about some of the clinical components for the metabolic waste that residually gets left in the body. Okay, but what we would like to see happen is this hydrolysis and the breakdown of that fat material allows for a glucose-like product. It is not glucose, but through the process of gluconeogenesis. Gluco meaning glucose, neo meaning new, genesis is the formation of. Through the formation of new glucose-like products. But again, our big, it's going to cost you. The big byproduct is going to be ketone bodies that are built up. We can send it through the citric acid cycle and we can convert energy or produce energy just as though we have gone through oxidative catabolism. Glucose in the presence of oxygen provides for us energy plus CO2 plus H2O. So remember, gluconeogenesis is a way to convert lipids and or proteins to become energy fuel sources that are glucose-like in their nature. Okay, utilization of lipids. The only thing that I want you to be able to identify are the triglycerides, and the triglycerides are the short-term format of the lipids that are being stored in generally the liver, but also rotating through the blood. And they're a really good indicator of how much fat we have residing, number one, in the blood, and number two, in some of those storage areas. And so where we see high triglyceride levels, we're very, very concerned that we're not able to balance the amount that's being taken in with the amount that's being burned as fuels or used as insulation sources, because lipids are very, very, very important, especially to children. Number one, they are a fuel source, not our best one, but we can use them. Number two, they provide a lot of insulation and heat retention. Number three, they are a shock absorber for a lot of the trauma that we go through on a daily basis. And number four, and what's most important to children, they make up all of that myelin sheath that's coating their central nervous system. So we want to give them really good nutritional component lipid pieces while their brain is developing to help them develop out really great myelin sheath around those nerves to be able to conduct much more efficiently. Let's talk about proteins. Here are our sources. Now, there are a number of plant-based sources, and we've done a much better job with the legumes in finding those plant-based sources. However, still the bulk of and the level of the concentration of the proteins most concentrated in these areas right here, okay? Excesses will lead to obesity and kidney dysfunction, and that's one of the big ones, okay? Breaking